The tow truck driver squinted at me as I stood dripping wet in front of him, holding a half-slapped fish in one hand and my fishing rod in the other. He pointed over his shoulder with a thumb and said, deadpan, "Lady in a golf cart told us it was a rogue flotation device. Said it needed impounding immediately." Behind him, my kayak, my peaceful little green vessel that I had just used to reel in the best catch of my season, was strapped up on the back of the truck like a captured criminal. I hadn't even reached the dock yet before HOA Karen decided to make my day explode in the most ridiculous, surreal way possible. My first thought wasn't even rage. It was, how the hell do you even tow a kayak off the water without alerting the fishermen currently using it? Rewind 2 hours earlier and it was the kind of morning that made life feel golden. The lake shimmered, no breeze yet, just the soft hum of dragonflies buzzing past and the occasional splash from a curious bass breaking the surface. I was paddling lazily on the glassy water, my hat tilted just low enough to keep the sun from glaring in my eyes. There was peace here. My slice of calm in a world ruled by email dings and HOA notices pinned passive-aggressively to doors. I lived at the edge of this lake, and had done so for 5 years. Built my home with my own 2 hands. Started a little bait and tackle shed by the side of the road, and carved out a quiet life where nothing really got to me. That all changed when Karen got elected president of the HOA 6 months ago. She came in like a hurricane of policies and pickiness, measuring grass height with a ruler, counting decorative flamingos, but no one thought she'd come for the lake. The lake had always been our shared ground, our escape from the nonsense. Until that morning, I genuinely believed she wouldn't dare touch it. When I finally paddled back to shore, something felt off. My usual spot at the dock was surrounded by orange cones and a plastic chain. A laminated sign read, "Lake access temporarily restricted per HOA directive." I thought it was some kind of prank. I dragged my kayak halfway onto the sand, walked toward the bait shack, and that's when I saw the truck reversing toward the water. I jogged up to the driver, bewildered, thinking maybe he was confused or lost. But no. He pointed straight to my kayak, checked a clipboard, and began winching it up like it was an illegally parked Buick. I told him I had just been fishing on it. His response? That line about a rogue flotation device. I demanded to know who ordered this. He simply pointed toward the hill where Karen sat proudly in her stupid little electric golf cart, sunglasses on, sipping a drink through a reusable metal straw like she was overseeing some government-level operation. I marched up, soaked feet squelching in my boots, furious. Karen smiled like a smug cat who'd just eaten every bird in the garden. She handed me a yellow citation slip. Unauthorized vessel use. Failure to comply with HOA watercraft registration. Illegal mooring. I stared at it like it was written in alien language. I tried to reason, to explain that I had been using that kayak on this lake for years, long before her HOA dictatorship began. She didn't even blink. Just said, "You'll have to take it up with the board. Or pay the fine and submit a permit request for next time." The fine was $200. $200 to get back a kayak I'd owned for 7 years. That was one thing. But the principle of it? That was another. This wasn't just about the kayak. It was about power. Karen had found yet another lever to pull, another way to show she had her hand on the thermostat of every resident's life. And the smug look on her face said it all. She was enjoying this. Too much. Back at home, I stewed. I stared at the water from my porch, half expecting her to start charging the ducks for swimming too loud. A buddy of mine, Charlie, stopped by that afternoon, saw the empty kayak rack, and asked what happened. I told him the story and he just laughed, then half-jokingly said, "You should just buy the lake, man. Own it. Then you can tow her golf cart and call it unauthorized shoreline activity." We both laughed. But my brain didn't let the joke go. Because Charlie, as it happened, worked in the county records office, and he knew some things. That night, over a couple of beers and a fire pit, he explained something that made my jaw drop. The lake wasn't actually owned by the HOA. It had always been leased from the original developers, and that lease was coming up for renewal in under 6 weeks. The HOA had first rights to renew, but anyone could submit a counteroffer. And if the offer was compelling enough, the board could choose a new lessee entirely. I barely slept that night. The thought looped over and over. I could buy the lake. Not metaphorically. Not in the way people joke about buying things out of spite. Literally. I could legally take it from her grip and turn the tables so hard her golf cart would flip. The next morning, I went straight to the county office. Got the paperwork. Read every clause. The current lease was shockingly outdated. The price to take it over wasn't even insane, it was just tucked under layers of bureaucracy, and no one had ever bothered to look. I called a lawyer friend who owed me a favor, asked him to read the document. His response was music to my ears. If you file everything correctly and bid even 10% over the last lease, you've got a real shot. It wouldn't be easy. I'd need to act fast. I'd need money. But I had enough savings. And a whole lot of motivation. Karen had fired the first shot in a war she didn't even know she was starting. She thought taking my kayak was the end of the story. But it was just the beginning. By the end of that week, I had everything filed. I kept it quiet. Didn't tell the neighbors. Didn't let even a whisper slip toward the HOA. I wanted her blindsided. I wanted the moment where her smug expression froze, mid-sip, because the lake she thought she ruled had been taken out from under her, legally, quietly, and permanently. I sat back on my porch again that night, watching the moon reflect over the water. The lake that had once been my escape had now become my battlefield. But soon, it would be my victory. Karen didn't know it yet. But the next time she saw me on the water, it wouldn't be as a resident breaking rules. It'd be as the person who made them. The next few days were a whirlwind of paperwork, whispered phone calls, and quiet determination. While the rest of the neighborhood mowed their lawns and rolled their garbage bins to the curb like any ordinary week, I was deep in legal clauses, surveying contracts, and setting up meetings with the county water board. The lake had always been more than just a view from my porch. It was part of my identity, my peace, my home. Now, it was about to become something far more powerful. The more I dug into the leasing arrangement, the more I realized just how little the HOA truly controlled. They had convinced everyone for years that the lake was theirs to govern, when in reality they were leasing it through a third-party agreement established decades ago. The contract was due for renewal, and the HOA had assumed it would roll over like it always had. But the county required public notice for lease renewals, and the HOA had failed to meet several transparency clauses. That technicality cracked the door open for someone like me to slide in with a counterproposal, and I intended to kick that door off its hinges. The county clerk's office was quiet when I walked in with the bid paperwork under my arm. I had triple-checked everything. My offer was 15% above the existing lease terms, included a maintenance plan for water quality, and even promised community access with environmental oversight. It was everything the county had been asking the HOA to provide for years, but never received. The clerk skimmed through my file and gave a slow, surprised nod. "You did your homework," she said. I nodded without a word, but my heart was beating like I had just run a marathon. This wasn't just about a kayak anymore. This was about principle. About balance. About giving people like Karen a reason to think twice before pulling power trips on their neighbors. Meanwhile, I kept things quiet in the neighborhood. Karen was still patrolling in her little golf cart, clipboard in hand, issuing notices for trash cans being out 30 minutes too long. She had no idea what was coming. I overheard her at the community garden talking to another board member, ranting about new signs she planned to install banning inflatable raft. "They're tacky. We're not running a water park," she sneered. Her arrogance was growing by the day, and I knew that would only make the eventual reveal sweeter. What I didn't expect was for her to start tightening her grip on the lake access. She posted a new policy banning water activities before 9 a.m. and after 5 p.m., citing noise complaints. A few neighbors grumbled but didn't push back. People were tired. They'd watched others challenge the HOA before and saw how it always ended, with threats, fees, and humiliation. Karen had created an environment of quiet compliance, and it was suffocating. But I could feel a shift beginning. One afternoon, as I walked past the lake trail, an older man named Walt flagged me down. He was a retired teacher and a quiet fixture in the neighborhood. "Heard your kayak got impounded," he said with a half-smile. I nodded. He chuckled and leaned in. About time someone did something about her. By the end of the week, my bid had been reviewed and advanced to final consideration. The county would be holding a private review session to select the new leaseholder. They told me it looked very promising but couldn't make guarantees. It was technically still open to other interested parties. That's when I realized something chilling. Karen had no idea, but she might still have time to file a competing bid if she got wind of it. I needed to make sure she didn't. So I played it cool. I acted defeated. I made a show of buying a second-hand rowboat and paddling around aimlessly, pretending I had accepted the kayak debacle. Meanwhile, I was preparing to take ownership of the entire body of water beneath me. Karen, however, began to grow suspicious. I noticed her loitering more often by the lake, standing and staring at the water as if sensing something out of place. One morning I caught her taking photos of my bait shop from across the street. Another day, she stopped by my driveway and casually asked if I had resolved my little boating violation. I shrugged and told her I'd given up on fishing for a while. "Can't fight the system, right?" I said with just the right amount of fake disappointment. She bought it, or at least, she wanted to. But Karen's paranoia grew. One afternoon, two teenagers in matching polos were walking the edge of the lake with walkie-talkies, taking pictures of paddleboards and raft. I confronted one of them, and he said they were part of the new HOA Lake Patrol. Karen had actually hired her own junior enforcement team. I nearly laughed in his face. The idea that this woman thought she needed surveillance on a lake she didn't even own was so over the top it bordered on cartoon villainy. I let it go. Let her keep digging her own hole. The weekend before the county's final decision, something unexpected happened. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. It was supposed to be about lake safety and neighborhood unity, but it quickly devolved into a rant about unlicensed vessels, unauthorized use, and her concerns that external actors were trying to undermine the HOA's authority. I sat in the back, wearing sunglasses and sipping from a giant big gulp cup, doing my best not to burst out laughing. She was getting desperate. She even floated the idea of lobbying the county to purchase the lake outright, completely unaware that I had already beaten her to it. The next morning, I received the call. The county had officially awarded the lease to me. It was done. The ink was drying. I was now the legal lessee and operator of the entire lake. My heart thundered in my chest, not just with excitement, but with a deep, satisfying sense of justice. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to make threats or call the police or post passive-aggressive notices on people's doors. I had simply outmaneuvered her with patience, research, and precision. I didn't announce it right away. I wanted the reveal to be perfect. I planned a small get-together with some neighbors, just the people who had quietly supported me through the nonsense. We grilled burgers, watched the sunset, and I let them in on the secret. The reactions were priceless. Walt nearly dropped his beer. Another neighbor clapped me on the back and said, "You're going to be a legend." It felt good. Not just because I had one, but because it gave the whole community a little spark. A sign that maybe, just maybe, the reign of HOA tyranny was not as unshakable as it seemed. But the best part was still coming. Karen had no idea what was headed her way. She thought she was still in control, still queen of the lake, still running her little empire from a clipboard and a smile full of teeth. But the waters were shifting. And when she found out who really held the reins now, it would hit her like a tidal wave. The look on Karen's face when I dropped the news was everything I hoped for and more. It happened during the monthly HOA meeting, which she always treated like a royal court session. She stood at the front of the community hall, wearing her trademark salmon-colored cardigan, addressing the room like she was running for president. Her speech was the usual nonsense about neighborhood integrity, lake safety, and her deep concern about outsiders misusing the community's resources. She was in rare form, suggesting new kayak registration stickers, increased HOA fees to fund lake surveillance, and even a curfew on dock usage. That was my cue. I stood up in the back and cleared my throat just loud enough for the room to hush. Karen's eyes landed on me, that usual smirk forming like she already had a response locked and loaded. I walked calmly to the front, pulled out a rolled document from my jacket, and placed it on the table. "You might want to read this before you suggest any more lake curfews," I said. She scoffed and unfolded it, clearly ready to dismiss it as a complaint or a neighborly petition. But the moment her eyes locked onto the county seal and the official header, Waterway Lease Transfer and Operating Rights Agreement, her expression shifted. The smirk cracked. Her lips moved like she was trying to find a sentence, but nothing came out. The board members leaned in to read it over her shoulder. Gasps scattered through the room like firecrackers. I turned to the residents and simply said, "Effective last week, I am now the legal leaseholder and operator of this lake. From shoreline to shoreline. The county approved my bid. This document confirms it." The silence in the room could have shattered glass. Karen sputtered something about legality and process, but she couldn't form a full sentence. I let her flail for a moment before gently adding, "Oh, and don't worry, I plan to keep lake access open to the public. Permits are free to all residents, except those with a record of harassment, unauthorized enforcement activity, or attempted misuse of towing services. So unfortunately, Karen, that disqualifies you." Laughter broke out. Real, cathartic, belly-deep laughter from neighbors who had been under her thumb for months. Karen's face flushed red, then pale, then some shade of purple in between. She tried to regain composure, pulling herself up to her full height and declaring that this was a matter for the HOA legal committee. But one of the board members, Steve, who had always looked vaguely terrified of Karen, stood up and quietly said, "Actually, Karen, if the lease is no longer in our name, then your lake policies don't apply. We'll have to discuss this new development." She looked betrayed. The room felt like it had shifted out from under her feet. The next morning, I began posting new signage around the lake. Clean, simple signs that read, "Private lake, permitted residents welcome, HOA access restricted." I wasn't interested in punishing anyone. Most neighbors were fine, even friendly. The problem was Karen and her clique of overzealous rule enforcers. They had acted like the lake was their property for years. Now they were getting a taste of their own medicine. I made sure every compliant neighbor had an approved permit by the end of the day. Kids were back on paddleboards, fishing lines were flying again, and the oppressive silence that had taken hold of the lake vanished almost overnight. But Karen didn't back off. Not at all. She doubled down. That same week, she tried to launch a smear campaign claiming I had illegally acquired the lease. Flyers appeared on doors with ridiculous accusations. "Is our lake being stolen?" and "unauthorized seizure of community property," complete with dramatic stock photos of people crying next to dry dock. It was pathetic. The thing she didn't realize was that people were sick of her. Instead of fueling outrage, her flyers became neighborhood joke. One kid added googly eyes to the crying face on the flyer and taped it to her own mailbox. A few days later, she tried to sneak onto the lake wearing a hoodie, oversized sunglasses, and an inflatable flamingo float. I kid you not. It was so ridiculous that I thought it was a prank at first. But no, there she was, slowly drifting across the water like a poorly disguised cartoon villain. I watched from the dock through binoculars, sipping my coffee. She didn't even make it 30 feet before the motion-triggered sprinklers I'd installed along the perimeter dock activated. She shrieked, slipped off the flamingo, and thrashed her way back to shore like a soggy raccoon. A few residents witnessed it and tried to keep straight faces, but I heard the laughter echo for blocks. The following week, I held a casual meeting at my bait shack for anyone who wanted to learn more about the new lake policies. I expected maybe 10 people. Over 50 showed up. Families brought coolers, lawn chairs, even cookies. It turned into a block party. People shared their Karen horror stories, from tickets for unauthorized plant arrangements to warnings about improper bird feeder heights. One man told a story about how Karen once accused his grandmother of violating HOA dress code because she wore a muumuu with cartoon ducks on it. The crowd was in stitches. The dam had broken. Everyone had had enough. I realized this wasn't just about reclaiming the lake. It was about reclaiming the neighborhood. Karen tried a last-ditch legal maneuver, filing a cease and desist order claiming my lease violated her authority. But the county responded with a curt letter clarifying the lake had never been under HOA ownership and that her complaint was without merit. That shut her up, temporarily. She still stomped around in her golf cart like she was conducting military surveillance, but now people openly waved and smiled like she was part of a traveling circus. Her power was draining fast, and she knew it. One night, a group of residents came to me with an idea: a regatta. A small, friendly kayak and canoe race around the lake, followed by a potluck barbecue. I loved it. We scheduled it for the following weekend. I knew Karen would seethe, but this was exactly the kind of community energy she had crushed. We brought it back in style. The event was a hit. Kids raced across the water, couples picnicked on the shore, and someone even brought a karaoke machine. I built a makeshift podium and gave out silly handmade trophies: best hat, slowest paddle, loudest cheering section. The final award of the day was a small wooden plaque, painted in glittery letters: Karen Free Zone Champion. The crowd erupted when I placed it next to the dock with a wink. Karen wasn't present, of course. She had been denied a permit and informed twice by the sheriff's office that any unauthorized entry would be considered trespassing. By the time the sun set and the last of the kayaks drifted back to shore, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. Not just for me but for everyone. The lake had become a symbol again. Not of HOA control, but of community, freedom, and a little well-earned pettiness. The HOA board, seeing how well the event went and how residents rallied together, started to change their tune. They scheduled a meeting to review leadership conduct, which everyone knew was code for Karen's eventual downfall. But I didn't need to attend that meeting. I had already won my battle. I had reclaimed my kayak, my lake, and in a way, I had helped the whole neighborhood breathe again. Karen had cast herself as queen of the water, but now she was just another landlocked resident with no throne, no paddle, and no say. And that was just the way it needed to be. Karen's spiral wasn't just slow, it was dramatic, messy, and public. The woman who once held HOA meetings like royal decrees had now become the community's most embarrassing sideshow. After the regatta, her presence around the lake turned from a threat into something closer to a joke. She still drove that squeaky golf cart, still glared over her oversized sunglasses at anyone who dared smile near the water, but the air around her had shifted. People no longer looked afraid. They looked amused. And that only made her more unhinged. Her next move was almost cartoonish in its execution. She called the local news station. The segment aired on a Wednesday evening and opened with a slow zoom on Karen sitting on her porch with her arms crossed and a frown so exaggerated it looked glued on. The headline read, "Local HOA Leader Says Lake Seized by Rogue Resident." Her version of events sounded like a telenovela. According to her, I was a disgruntled lake user who manipulated county officials, stole the lease through shady back channels, and had a vendetta against peaceful community life. She even claimed I had outlawed paddleboard yoga as a way to spite her wellness initiative. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so pathetic. But karma, as always, has a sense of timing. Within hours of the broadcast, the internet did what it does best: dug up receipt. A Reddit thread started compiling every bizarre HOA memo she'd ever sent. Screenshots of her emails circulated, including the one where she threatened a family with fines for allowing their toddler to chalk on the sidewalk. Someone found footage from her screaming at kids for having squirt guns at the lake. And then came the final blow, a video from the regatta last year, before I took over, where she was caught berating an elderly veteran for using a fishing stool that wasn't HOA approved. The clip went viral. Suddenly, Karen wasn't a victim. She was a meme. Even local news stations issued a quiet update the next day. Leaseholder acquisition confirmed as legal and transparent. No one missed the implication. Karen had officially lost the public's sympathy. Her plan to shame me had backfired in glorious, spectacular fashion. And just when I thought she might finally retreat, she decided to try one more time, to sabotage the lake itself. It happened on a foggy Sunday morning. I was doing maintenance work near the southern dock, checking on the newly planted reeds and cleaning out some minor debris. That's when I noticed the water line looked slightly off. Not much, but enough to raise suspicion. I walked toward the outflow gate on the north side, and that's when I saw it. Karen, hunched over in her floral windbreaker, screwdriver in hand, trying to pry open the manual release valve that controlled the lake's drainage. She was so focused she didn't even hear me approach until I was standing 5 feet behind her. When she turned and saw me, she froze like a raccoon caught in a trash can. Her eyes widened, her face pale. "This isn't what it looks like," she stammered. I raised my phone and hit record. "Actually," I said calmly, "it looks exactly like you're trying to illegally drain the lake." She lunged at me, but tripped over a root and fell backwards into the mud. I called the sheriff's office right then and there. By the time they arrived, she was still sitting there, soaked, sputtering excuses and demanding they arrest me instead. The deputies calmly explained to her that she was on private property, caught attempting to damage public resources, and that tampering with the lake infrastructure was a crime. She was charged with environmental tampering and trespassing. The arrest wasn't dramatic, just quiet, pathetic, and overdue. A few neighbors peeked out their windows as she was escorted into the patrol car. No one said anything. They didn't need to. The silence said it all. Karen's fall from grace was complete. But the consequences weren't done yet. The HOA board, embarrassed beyond words, convened an emergency session the following week. The meeting was packed, standing room only. Karen didn't show up, likely on legal advice. One by one, residents took the mic. They spoke about years of intimidation, bogus fines, the weaponization of bylaws, and the fear that came with challenging her authority. People who had never spoken at meetings before stood up to share how Karen had made them feel small, unwelcome, or watched. It wasn't angry. It was cathartic. Then the board voted, unanimously, to remove her as HOA president and permanently ban her from holding any leadership position in the future. The room burst into applause. Some people even stood up and cheered. Afterward, I walked home along the lake path as the sun dipped low on the horizon. The air was warm, the water calm, and for the first time in months, the entire neighborhood felt at ease. But there was one final formality to complete. The sheriff's department had issued her a no-trespass order. As the leaseholder, I had signed it myself. It wasn't just symbolic, it was legal. Karen could no longer step foot within 20 feet of the lake. If she did, she'd be arrested on the spot. I printed out a laminated copy of the order and posted it at each lake entry point, just beneath the permit access signs. I even placed a framed version near the old dock, where her favorite bench used to sit. Someone added a plastic flamingo next to it. I never found out who, but it made me laugh for a full minute. The neighborhood had a sense of humor again. People were smiling more. Kids were back on the shore with fishing rods. An elderly couple started holding morning Tai Chi sessions by the water, something Karen had once banned because it looked like cult behavior. There was even a suggestion floated to turn the lake into a community co-op, with me as the manager. I didn't say yes or no. I just told them I was happy to see people enjoying it again. I didn't want to turn it into a business. I just wanted it to remain free, open, and sane. No more fake rules, no more power trip. Just people, water, and peace. One afternoon, I saw Karen from a distance, standing on the sidewalk just beyond the 20-foot restriction zone. She was watching the lake with a blank expression. Not angry. Not plotting. Just empty. Her golf cart was parked behind her, faded and dented. She didn't say anything. Didn't wave. Just stood there for a moment, then turned around and walked away. It was the last time I ever saw her near the water. The neighborhood newsletter that month included a cartoon drawing of a kayak with the headline, "New Leadership, Smooth Waters." It didn't mention Karen by name. It didn't have to. Everyone knew. The change had happened. And it wasn't because someone shouted louder or played dirtier. It was because someone had been willing to do the work, to outthink the chaos, and to push back without becoming the villain. The lake remained calm that evening. The sky turned orange, casting golden streaks across the surface. I sat by the edge in a chair with a cold drink and watched the ripples move outward in soft waves. The air smelled like summer and pine. A boy nearby reeled in a fish, shouted with joy, and his parents clapped. And for the first time since this whole thing began, I didn't feel like I was in a battle anymore. I felt like I was home. In the weeks following Karen's permanent removal from the HOA and the finalization of the no trespassing order, the neighborhood felt like it had woken up from a long, frustrating dream. The air was lighter, laughter was more frequent, and the lake no longer felt like a war zone guarded by self-appointed tyrants in polo shirts. What had started as a petty act of control, a kayak being towed while I was still fishing, had spiraled into one of the most satisfying, unexpected reversals of power anyone in the community had ever witnessed. But now that the dust had settled and Karen had effectively exiled herself to the dry side of the sidewalk, a new chapter had quietly begun. One of the first things I did was restore the old community. It had been slowly falling apart for years, largely neglected because Karen claimed it wasn't aesthetic enough to meet her lake beautification standard. I replaced the rotting boards, added fresh sealant, and even brought in a few volunteers to help install solar lights along the edge. It was a quiet project, nothing flashy. But the symbolism was clear to everyone. This was a new era for the lake. Not an era of rules and red tape, but one of shared respect and actual community. More residents began showing up regularly. Teenagers started hosting early morning paddle practices. A father and son duo launched a small canoe building project near the bait shack, and an elderly group of neighbors began organizing weekend bird-watching outings. The energy around the lake transformed from tense and restrictive to welcoming and full of life. People came not because they were allowed to, but because they felt like they belonged again. And that mattered more than any revenge or victory ever could. Still, I didn't forget where it started. I kept the original citation Karen gave me, unauthorized flotation device, framed inside the bait shack. It sat right above the cash box, next to a photo of me holding up my first catch after the lake lease was transferred. Everyone who came to the shop eventually noticed it, and the story behind it turned into neighborhood lore. Parents would point it out to their kids and say, "See that paper? That's what happens when someone thinks they can own the world with a clipboard." People laughed, but the lesson stuck. There was, of course, the question of whether Karen would ever try to stage a comeback. And for a brief moment, it looked like she might. Rumors spread that she was trying to gather signatures for a new HOA subcommittee, something vague and confusingly named like Neighborhood Visual Compliance Oversight. But it never gained traction. The damage to her reputation was permanent. No one was willing to attach their name to her again. Most people didn't even return her phone calls. Even the board members who had once supported her began advocating for term limits and leadership transparency. Karen wasn't just out of power, she had become a cautionary tale. I never gloated. Not directly. I didn't need to. I just kept doing what I'd been doing since day one, maintaining the lake, welcoming residents, and living my life in peace. But every now and then, I'd throw in a little poetic justice. One day, I had a new sign made and posted it by the community dock. It read, "Kayak parking zone, all flotation devices welcome, except rogue ones." Anyone who knew the story laughed out loud the first time they saw it. Eventually, the county reached out and offered to help designate the lake as a community-supported conservation area. That meant funding for ecological upkeep, native plant restoration, and long-term preservation, while still allowing residential recreational use. I agreed without hesitation. It was the perfect long-term safeguard against future Karens. The lake wouldn't just belong to me. It would belong to everyone who respected it. And it would be protected by more than just HOA whims. In the middle of all this, a local journalist showed up wanting to do a follow-up piece. They had covered Karen's arrest in a small article buried in the back of the community paper, but now that the story had gone viral online, they wanted the full scoop. I was hesitant at first. I didn't want to turn my life into clickbait. But then I realized something: the story wasn't about me. It was about the idea that bullies in suits or golf carts or HOA jackets don't always win. That sometimes, if you play it smart and keep your head down, you can beat them at their own game and make something better in the process. So I gave the interview. I told them everything from the beginning, from the moment my kayak got towed to the day Karen was escorted away in handcuffs. The article was titled, "The Kayak That Sank a Kingdom." It blew up. Not just locally. People across the country reached out with similar HOA horror stories, thanking me for showing that it was possible to fight back without becoming vindictive. Some sent photos of their own lakes and ponds with signs that read "Karen-Free Zone." One guy even mailed me a miniature kayak trophy carved out of driftwood. It sat on my windowsill from that day forward. One sunny Saturday afternoon, a group of kids held a lemonade stand near the trail entrance. They'd drawn a big poster board that said, "Lake Celebration Day, free lemonade for anyone with a paddle." I couldn't resist. I grabbed my kayak, paddled halfway across, docked, and got a paper cup filled with warm, sweet juice. The kids high-fived me like I was some kind of local hero. One of them asked, "Is it true you bought the whole lake just because of a kayak ticket?" I laughed and replied, "I bought the lake because someone forgot that rules are meant to protect people, not control them." That earned an "oh snap" from the group, and they ran off giggling. Later that evening, I paddled out one more time by myself. The sky was clear, the water still, and the only sounds were frogs croaking in the reeds and the soft swish of the paddle cutting through the surface. I stopped at the middle of the lake and let myself drift. I looked back at the shore, at the lights from the houses, the families grilling dinner, the dogs splashing at the edge. All of it felt earned. I thought about Karen, about how her obsession with power had led to her downfall, how a single impulsive act, towing someone's kayak without cause, had started a domino effect that not only removed her from power but actually improved the entire neighborhood. It was funny how things worked out sometimes. One little boat had brought down a whole empire of pettiness. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small stone I'd found weeks ago near the outflow valve, where Karen had tried to drain the lake. I'd kept it for some reason, maybe as a reminder. It was smooth, flat, and fit perfectly in my palm. I held it for a moment, then flicked it out over the water. It skipped 3 times, then sank quietly beneath the surface. There was no need for anger anymore. No need for revenge. I had everything I wanted. Not just the lake, but the peace that came with knowing I stood up for something worth protecting. As the sun sank below the horizon and the sky turned to a soft orange glow, I picked up my paddle and began the slow, satisfying return home. The water rippled behind me, steady and clean, and not a rogue flotation device in sight.